Prehistoric marvel or 20th century fake? Danes, Romans, Druids or aliens? Come with me as we explore the reality of when Stonehenge was built and who built it. Spoiler, it wasn't aliens. This is Stonehenge, Access All Areas. Now, hopefully, if you watched our first film, you'll have got a pretty good idea about what Stonehenge is, that it's this complicated monument of chalk and stones from far and wide arranged to make this amazing building. But one of the questions that's exercised people over the centuries really is when was it built and by implication who built it? Now, if you go back to the early medieval period, it was quite easy to explain it because you could bring in people like Merlin, the wizard, and giants. But really, that's not proper history. And it was, I suppose, in the 17th and 18th century that people started to speculate about who'd built it using people that they knew about. So there's the suggestion that it was built by the Danes, in other words, by Vikings or by Romans, because it was seen as a sophisticated architectural structure that couldn't have been built by these crude ancient Britons. But of course what you have to remember is that at this time the whole concept of a distant past was something that was quite difficult to understand because people were working within a biblical chronology. Archbishop Usher had calculated that the world was created on October the 23rd, 4004 BC. So everything had to be fitted into that time frame. And in fact, Stonehenge was described in the first guidebook in 1823 as being antediluvian. So in other words, it was one of the few solid buildings that survived the Great Flood. So that was the sort of overall time frame. And also, early archaeologists who dug and found things didn't really understand how to make sense of the objects they'd found because, you know, they'd dig into barrows and find stone tools, and then they'd find things made of bronze and they'd find things made of iron. But the way these were seen sometimes was more in terms of status. So, you know, if you were poor, you had stone. If you were a bit better off, you had iron. And if you were posh, you had bronze. It wasn't until the 1820s that the Danish archaeologist C.J. Thompson worked out that these were actually a sequence, that there was an age of stone succeeded by an age of bronze, succeeded by an age of iron. The three-age system, which is how we divide up our prehistoric past. So that was the basis of understanding, but there was no idea of prehistory at this time, of a time before written records. So it was with all this in mind that we look at the excavation history of Stonehenge, because this is where the information has come from that enables us to work out a sequence of events. So the first excavation was proper scientific excavation, was 1901, and that was when stone 56, the tallest stone, was straightened. And this chap, Professor William Gowland, did a small excavation around the base of the stone, very scientific. So one of his workmen is digging inside what's effectively a box. Now this is Gowland's registering frame, which means that you can plot three-dimensionally any object that's found there. This is very advanced for 1901. He promptly published his work and came to the conclusion that this stone, and by implication the trilithons, were raised at the end of the age of stone and the beginning of the age of bronze. He put that at about 1800 BC. Now he was absolutely right about this end of the age of stone, but we now know from scientific dating that that watershed is a lot earlier, probably about 6 or 7 centuries earlier. So that was Gowland. And then in the 1920s, after Stonehenge had been given to the nation, we have a lot more excavation. carried out by Colonel Hawley in the early 1920s, which were to do with restoration work on the stones, but also his brief was to dig the whole of Stonehenge, but he actually only managed about half of it. But you see, he dug out a load of the ditch around here, all the Aubrey holes, and fortunately he ran out of steam before he actually finished. Sadly, he never wrote up the results of his excavations apart from short notes after each season. We then fast forward to the 1950s after the Second World War, and very extensive excavations in the centre by Richard Atkinson, Stuart Pigott and Marcus Stone, ostensibly hoping to write up Hawley's unpublished excavations and do a bit more research. This grew, with the biggest excavation being where the 3 stones of a trilithon lay flat on the ground. The one that fell over in 1797, it was going to be re-erected. This was Operation Trilithon in the late 1950s. And of course, this gave the opportunity to excavate a very large area. And the complexity of it, which you can see from the photographs, it's extraordinary. Pits, holes everywhere, representing different stages of the construction and modification of Stonehenge. Sadly, what Atkinson did was he wrote a book called Stonehenge, in which he explained his idea about the sequence, but the scientific publication of his results didn't happen. And it wasn't until the late 1990s that all of the results of the 20th century excavations were pulled together in a big volume, which really illustrated just how much had been done. You know, you look at the complexity of everything, you know, the individual stone holes, you know, the fallen stones, the pits, the post holes, you know, just incredible complexity. Sadly, originally not very well recorded. But it was the basis of this and of scientific dating that enables us to work out the sequence at Stonehenge. Now, radiocarbon dating, the first radiocarbon date for Stonehenge came in the 1950s, a very early one. And it works on the principle that everything living, me, the wood of the table, that antler, is all based on carbon. We're called carbon-based life forms. One of the isotopes of carbon is a radioactive one called carbon-14. And there's very little of it. There's only about 1 atom in every million that is radioactive. And it has this wonderful property that when the living thing stops living and stops absorbing extra carbon, that radioactivity declines, it decays, it fades away, but not in a steady way. You know, you'd like to think if you plotted time this way and the amount that's left, that you might have a nice straight line. But no, it doesn't. It goes in a very gentle curve. Radiocarbon has what's called a half-life of about 5,000 years. What that means that in 5,000 years, half of its radioactivity is gone. In another 5,000 years, half of what's left has gone. And so it gradually tails off, with the result that you can't really date things back more than about 50,000 years using this method. What it involves is dating anything that was organic, anything that was living. So of course, you know, for Stonehenge, the antler picks that were used to dig the ditch and the stone holes are great, because if you assume that a pick at the bottom of a ditch was what was used to dig the ditch, then the pick dates the time that the ditch was dug. I mean, the best example at Stonehenge is that there's a tip of an antler that's actually broken off, embedded in the edge of a stone hole. Now, you can't get a better really bit of dating than that. But of course, you can use other things. You can use wood, you can use charcoal. But with wood, you've got to be careful, because if you have a lump of charcoal like that, you don't know whether it's come from the middle of a tree or the edge of a tree. And if it's oak, that could be 200, 300 years difference. So what we look for are things more like twigs, because that's only going to have grown over a couple of years. And the very best samples come from nutshells, because hazelnuts are a staple part of a prehistoric diet. If you're roasting them, you tend to char them, they survive, and of course that only grows in 1 year. What we've learnt though is that single radiocarbon dates aren't any use, because they will give you a range. There's a plus or minus, so it might be 2,500 years plus or minus 50, which means that somewhere within that 100-year bracket, that date is likely to fall. But the more dates that you have from the same thing, you can narrow it down. And the precision of the radiocarbon dating itself has got much, much better. And you now only need tiny little samples. So what you can do by combining lots of dates together and using clever statistical analysis that I don't really quite understand, is you can narrow the gap down. What this has allowed us to do is to work out the sequence of events at Stonehenge. Now, rather than using reconstruction drawings or computer graphics, what I'm going to do is to take the Blue Peter approach and use the materials that I take to primary schools when I'm talking about Stonehenge. It usually works. So what we have to do is start off just before 3000 BC with a green field. And the first thing that we know that happened is that a ditch and bank enclosure were constructed. And there is one main entrance here which points to the northeast. So we've got the bank, and then we've got the ditch, which is where the material for the bank came from. And it's been dug all round this side by Colonel Hawley in the 1920s, who described the ditch as not being regular. He said it looked like a string of badly made sausages. The key thing is, this would have been blazing white. It would have stood out really, really strongly against the green of the grass. More ditch. So, first stage, the ditch and bank. And note that it's not a proper henge, because its ditch is outside its bank, which is the opposite way round to what a proper henge should be. So this in some ways is more like an earlier Neolithic causewayed enclosure in its layout. It's sort of halfway in between. This dates to around 2950 BC. What we also know we've got at this stage is a series of pits just inside the bank, 56 Aubrey holes. So, ditch bank, small entrance in the south, bigger entrance facing northeast, 56 Aubrey holes. Debate about what, if anything, the Aubrey holes had in them. Was it timber uprights? Was it nothing, apart from the fact that we know that they contained burials? Or there is the suggestion that they might have held some of the bluestones. Now, this is something that some archaeologists say there is positive evidence for this. I'm not 100% convinced that there is evidence that the bluestones were here this early. So this is a matter of debate, shall we say. What we do know is that about, nearly 500 years after this, this had changed, because obviously the look of the enclosure had changed. No longer was it a brilliant white, chalky enclosure. It was silted up, overgrown, the bank would have been covered in grass. So I'm going to change the enclosure to what it would have looked like 500 years later. The enclosure looks very different because the ditch is silted up and the bank's covered in grass, and the Aubrey holes, whether or not they held stones, would have been perhaps less visible. There's some aspects that we're still not 100% certain about where they actually fit within the sequence, but there's a possibility that at this stage there are three stones, three large sarsens in a line around here, and the four station stones, the little sarsens that lie just inside the bank, there's a possibility that these are here at this stage as well. So there's four of them that form a rectangle, and I'm trying to make sure I get them in roughly the right place. Yes, this one probably needs to go a bit further around here. So these may also be part of the arrangement at this stage. But this is when a really big change happens here in the centre with the construction of the sarsen horseshoe of trilithons and the sarsen circle. Right, so that's the 5 sarsen trilithons forming a horseshoe with the open side pointing towards the entrance, and the circle of 30 upright sarsens with their linked lintels. But if you remember watching the first film, you realise that there is a problem with this complete circle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The problem stone, not big enough to support a lintel. Does this suggest that this bit wasn't completed? Actually, for the sake of this, I'm going to put these back because I quite like the complete circle. But what we do have at this time, as well as the sarsens, as well as the rearrangement of the stones in the entrance, is that we have blue stones as part of this central setting. Now, there is the argument that the 56 that were in the Aubrey holes are moved into the centre and augmented by some additional blue stones, which possibly stood in a henge monument down at West Amesbury. Conveniently, 56 plus the 24 that were in that monument make the 80, which is the sort of number that we think were here. But this first arrangement of the blue stones is quite odd. It's not symmetrical, it's not neat. It consists of pairs of blue stones in what are known as the Q and R holes. These are sort of dumbbell-shaped pits containing pairs of stones that is not consistent. There are gaps in it that we can't really explain. It just doesn't seem a very satisfactory arrangement. What's really fascinating, though, is that at this stage, within this first bluestone structure, we've also got some miniature bluestone trilithons. Now, we know about these because the stones were reused in a later setting. But what we've got is something that looks a bit like these, but is actually quite different, because they're some of the small pillars that support lintels. And we've got two of these lintels and evidence for the tenons on some of the other bluestones. But of course the question is, where did they stand? Now it's been suggested that they might have stood sort of framing the entrance, this major alignment through here, but we can't be certain of it. But what happens afterwards is that these bluestone trilithons are dismantled and their components are used in the next arrangement, which happens about 200, 300 years after this and is quite radical, but is the arrangement that we see in a ruined state today. So that is the rearrangement of these as pillars standing in a circle concentric with the Sarsen circle, and some very nice shaped pillars arranged initially in an oval and then later in a horseshoe in the centre. Sarsen circle, bluestone circle, Sarsen horseshoe, bluestone horseshoe, originally an oval with bits of it missing. And then of course the key stone, the altar stone, lying here just in front of the tallest of the trilithons, the amazing stone from Scotland. So this is the end of the stone structure, what we see today in ruins, with stones fallen, quite a lot of stones missing, particularly around that side of the circle. And of course that question about stone 11, was the circle ever complete? It's not the end of things at Stonehenge, because what happens around the same time that the bluestones are arranged is the removal of some of the stones from the entrance and the first stage of the avenue, the ditch and bank, which head out from the entrance along this alignment, downslope, and eventually curve round and reach the River Avon. So there are changes, and even that isn't the end of it, because in around 1600 BC, so we're now moving into the middle part of the Bronze Age. This is 1400 years after the ditch and bank were dug out. We've got two circles of pits dug around the outside of the stone circle. These are the Y and Z holes. At some stage, two of those four station stones that were put in quite early are replaced by low mounds known as the South Barrow and the North Barrow, although they're not barrows. Not quite sure when they happen. This is the end of a sequence that, of course, spans the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. It starts with the digging of the ditch in around, well, just after 3000 BC. It ends with the digging of these peculiar pits, the Y and Z holes, around the outside of the Sarsen circle in about 1600 BC. That's 1400 years. That's a very long time span during which Stonehenge evolves and is modified and changed. And of course, the fascinating question is, society has changed. So who were the builders and who were the modifiers? Whenever documentaries are made about Stonehenge, you can always be certain that one person is going to get a mention, and that's the Amesbury Archer, who's now a star exhibit in the Wessex Gallery of the Salisbury Museum. What you can see in the case here is the skeleton of a man lying in a crouched position. He was aged between 35 and 45 when he died, and he's got a few health problems. He's got an abscess on his jaw and a very badly damaged left leg. Even the kneecap was missing. But it's what he was buried with that is so remarkable, because he's a beaker burial. The name comes from this very distinctive type of finely decorated pots that you find with burials of this type, and most of them have one pot. He had 5. He's got a collection of beautiful, finely made flint arrowheads, and also a couple of pierced stone plates, which are wrist guards that archers would have worn to protect against the bowstring. So this is where he gets the name, the Amesbury Archer. But, perhaps more importantly, he's also got metal. He's got 3 small copper daggers. They don't look very impressive. They look a bit sort of green and crunchy, but what you have to remember is what they would have looked like when they were first made. They would have shone like the sun. Nobody'd seen anything like that before. And he's also got a couple of fine gold, presumably hair ornaments, which you assume that he was worn in braids in his hair. So he's got metal. But not only does he have metal, he may also have worked it, because in the grave is a peculiar shaped stone, which may be an anvil for metalworking. Now, this type of burial, where the body is buried in a crouched position with beaker pots and an array of other finds, this is something that we see on the continent centuries before. And so it's perhaps not surprising that when his bones were analysed, it was shown that he had come from the continent, as well as some of these objects. Now, the initial suggestion was that he came from Germany, which resulted in lurid tabloid headlines along the lines of "Achtung, Stonehenge was built by a German." Now, we know that it's not Germany, it's probably somewhere like the Swiss Alps. But what's interesting is this association with Stonehenge. He was described occasionally as the King of Stonehenge, because the assumption was that somebody rich and powerful like this must have been something to do with the building of this great stone monument. But in fact, it doesn't work. He arrives at least a century too late, and if he was that strongly associated with Stonehenge, why was he buried a couple of miles away on the other side of the River Avon? Now, this idea of associating somebody rich and powerful with the building of Stonehenge is nothing new. This is the 1995 official guidebook to Stonehenge, and in it is a reconstruction of the building of Stonehenge. And it's being directed by a man who's wearing some very elaborate objects. These are the objects that were found in Bush Barrow, a very, very rich Bronze Age barrow to the south of Stonehenge. But the only problem is that he was buried about 500 years at least after Stonehenge was constructed. So that doesn't work, and neither, I'm afraid, does the association between this person and the building of Stonehenge. So, as a result, I would like to suggest that we rename him, not the Amesbury Archer, but the Amesbury Tech Entrepreneur. Because that's, to me, what he is. What he's bringing to this country is new technology. The ability to smelt and cast metal. Maybe the ability to make these elaborate pots. All this obviously gave him great prestige and power and wealth, which is represented by this amazing array of goods that he was buried with and which were intended to take him to the next world. So, not the architect or the project manager. Science has helped us to tell the story of this remarkable individual, but what part did he play at this time of change? I sat down for a chat with my friend Edris Luprian, whose doctoral research is focused on just this fascinating time. Because, you look at the objects that he's buried with and you think, this person's not from around here, is he? You know, all
Yeah.
you know, the pots, the copper daggers, and everything else.
The anvil.
Yes,
All
yeah,
the technology for metalworking.
yeah. But that's all coming in from the continent, isn't it? And
Well, there's been that big debate, hasn't there? You know, was it artifacts and ideas that were coming over that were being adopted by an elite, or was it in fact people coming over, bringing this new culture with them? And I think that's been such a long debate, and that was kind of started to be resolved when the ancient DNA analysis started.
as I understand it, or in fact, as I don't understand it, which is why I wanted to sit down and talk to you, new genetic studies, you know, wider population genetic studies,
Yeah.
are showing something quite unusual, what seems to me quite unusual, happening, you know, probably after the time that Stonehenge is built in Sarsen, because, you know, that around 2500 BC, right at the very end of the Neolithic.
Yeah.
So, you know, that the Stonehenge that we recognise today is built by the people who are effectively the native inhabitants of Britain.
Yeah, the people with Neolithic ancestry.
Yeah. So where's their ancestry coming from?
So their ancestry originates over sort of in the Middle East. And these are what are known as the early European farmers. And they took thousands of years to kind of move out of the Middle East along either the Mediterranean route or up along the sort of the Danube. And so you've got these two movements of people coming through Europe, and then around 4000 BC, they make the jump
arrive
over the Channel and they arrive in Britain.
Yeah. And so they then, I mean, does their genetics mingle with because I mean, there's a population in Britain before that, and
Yeah.
there of hunter-gatherers.
Yes.
So are these the Western hunter-gatherer
They're the kind of the
population?
Western hunter-gatherer population, and it seems that there was very little intermixing between the early European farmers coming into this country and the Western hunter-gatherers.
Who were the people
Who were the
there?
people
well,
who
I
were
suppose
here
they've
at
been
the end of the
there
Ice Age.
since Britain became an island
Yeah,
several
yeah.
thousand years before that.
Yeah.
So that's the gene pool up to the end of the Neolithic.
Yeah.
And then we've obviously got evidence of people coming in. So it's
yeah.
not just the technology. There's these people coming in, you know. And I mean that term beaker folk. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's what
Beaker using people.
beaker using people is that the new term?
I think that's the
Because-
new term.
So what happens then with the gene pool at this time? Because this is where, aren't there suggestions that there is almost like a takeover in it?
Well, what actually seems to be happening is that you've got a movement of people coming out of a kind of Asia, sort of Eastern Europe, coming over in and sort of spreading westwards into Europe from kind of the Pontic Steppes area. And they had a quite a pastoralist lifestyle. They were kind of moving around with their domesticated animals. And then they start to move into Europe. But they're also moving at the same time further east.
And these are early metal users.
And these are the early metal users. Yeah.
So when they arrive in this country, how many people are turning up? Because, you know, we recognise them from these very rich individual burials, but surely those people can't have an effect, a big effect on the gene pool, can they?
There's good information that beaker-using people were bringing back a sort of a farming lifeway into this country. So during the middle and late Neolithic, people had sort of slightly moved away from the mixed farming idea, and they were becoming pastoralists and kind of moving around with their animals and surviving on their animal products, and not really doing very much in the way of growing cereal.
And this changes then?
And
with
this
the
changes
arrival
when the
of these-
beaker people come back in, that they're bringing this sort of mixed farming back in with them.
So does that mean that they're just going to be more successful?
Basically, the women are having more children. The beaker-using people are having more children than the late Neolithic women are having
So
over
their
their
population,
breeding
even if it starts
lifetime.
quite small, is
Going to grow faster.
Because I mean, I've tended to see something like that stage of Stonehenge and other big Neolithic monuments that are built at that time, you know, all over the country, as being this sort of, not the last gasp, but it's a people who are under pressure and who are aware that things are changing.
Yeah.
and are worried about it, so they're responding by constructing these bonkers monuments.
Appealing to their gods, or
Appealing to the
their
gods.
ancestors,
Yeah.
or someone to help them.
Yeah. So were they right to be worried?
Yes, they were, because the beaker using people coming in, these people with steppe ancestry, don't seem to have interbred with the late Neolithic people.
Yeah.
That again, you seem to have these sort of parallel lives going on, where there's a degree of intermixing, but it's very, very limited.
Right.
And so you have this period of time for about sort of 200 odd years where you've got late Neolithic continuing and the beaker population starting to expand.
But how's this reflected in the overall genetic makeup then of the population at this time?
Well, it is around about that sort of 2200 BC that the late Neolithic ancestry becomes very, very small, very, very limited, and that the gene pool has effectively become steppe ancestry.
I still find it quite difficult to get it in my head.
Yeah.
How in 300 years, which is 12 generations, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the time that this huge structure was built, in that time you've got a almost complete genetic replacement.
Yes.
of those Neolithic ancestors with this new beaker genetics.
Yeah, the steppe ancestry coming in.
Is this what the genetics are telling us?
So you have to think about the genetics. When you're talking about this sort of genomic replacement, you're talking about a very small fraction of the whole sort of genome of an individual, of a person. So 99.9% of our DNA is the same for all sort of humans. So there's 0.01% that is different.
Right.
And these are the differences that are being detected. So the vast majority of our DNA is the same, but there are certain characteristics that show variation, and these are sort of determined by what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms. So it's just a
Right.
change, SNPs.
Yeah,
It's just a change of a base sequence in the whole sequence of the millions of bases that we have in our DNA. And that what they're beginning to realise is that some of these areas of the human genome are particularly susceptible to change, and that if you get a number of those SNPs increasing in frequency in the population, you begin to be able to identify groups of people who share that same genetics. And so the beaker using people coming over were bringing a particular group of SNPs with them that can be identified as becoming the dominant in the gene pool in this country, and that the late Neolithic SNPs seem to disappear.
Yeah. Do you think there's the possibility that these people coming in are introducing pathogens or diseases to which they've become immune? You know, in a similar way to what happened in colonial times, where smallpox is introduced to indigenous populations and actually has a devastating effect on them. Is there any evidence? Is that a possibility that might have happened?
Well, again, ancient sort of DNA is revealing that there is evidence that there was the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis.
What, the plague?
The plague.
The Black Death plague?
The Black Death plague was around in Neolithic times. But it probably wasn't as virulent as the Black Death had become. And indeed, it doesn't have the genetic capacity. The Yersinia pestis doesn't have the genetic capacity for using the flea and the rat as a vector. And so it would be much more of a pneumonic form of the disease, where it's respiratory infection. There seems to be what's called the LNBA, the late Neolithic sort of Bronze Age strain of the Yersinia pestis, that seems to have moved with steppe ancestry out of Asia and into Europe. And so if the beaker using people arrived in this country and brought this new bacterium with them, then the people in this country who've been pretty much isolated from Europe for a couple of thousand years would be very susceptible to this new infection coming in.
When are we talking about this replacement? It's happened effectively, by about 2200?
2200-ish. Yeah, about the time that you get this sort of flurry of different styles of beaker pottery going on. Yeah. And it becomes regionalised. So the beaker using people have become very established, pretty much effectively all through the country.
Now you see, what's happening at Stonehenge at that time? This is when the bluestones are being
rearranged.
Is this newly dominant, these people who've taking over Stonehenge and going, okay, we're not going to move the Sarsens because they're quite big, but we have the capacity for remodelling the smaller stones, changing them, almost putting our stamp on this. The bluestone rearrangement does seem to
coincide,
tie in with that time. Yeah.
And when you say take over, I don't think it was done in an aggressive. There's no evidence for any sort of hostility.
You talk about, it's not a violent thing. How do we explain the Stonehenge Archer? There's another Bronze Age archer here in the Wessex Gallery at the Salisbury Museum. This is the Stonehenge Archer, whose bones were found in the ditch at Stonehenge in 1978 when an archaeologist called John Evans was taking some environmental samples. He wasn't laid out like this in an extended position. He was buried, crouched, with his bones somewhat jumbled about because it seems as if some large animal, probably a badger, had burrowed its way through the burial. He was buried with some very sort of beaker objects, stone wrist guard, and some very nice barbed and tanged flint arrowheads. So that's why he was called Stonehenge Archer, assumed that he was buried with some equipment that denoted who he was. But some of the tips of the arrows are missing. And when his bones were looked at in a little bit more detail, it was realised that some of the missing tips were actually embedded in his bones. So rather than being a sheaf of arrows that were grave goods, they were probably the cause of his death. I mean, probably the most disturbing of them is the one that was found embedded in his sternum, in his breastbone, but not from the front, from the back. And it appears that probably, the coup de grace, the final shot that killed him, might have been administered when he was lying flat on his face on the ground, shot at fairly close range at an angle. So, a fairly violent death. There's always been speculation about what he was. Was he a murder victim or was he a sacrifice? Now, I've never liked the idea of the murder victim, because if you're going to try and kill somebody and secrete their body somewhere, you're not going to do it in the ditch at Stonehenge, which was in active use at this time. It'd be like trying to hide a body in the precinct of Westminster Abbey. And neither do I think he's a sacrifice, because there isn't any evidence for sacrifice at this time in the Bronze Age. So can we look at a third alternative? He's not one of a lot of people buried at Stonehenge, because Colonel Hawley excavated about half the ditch and didn't find any burials there. He's buried on his own somewhere very special. His isotopes suggest that he's actually locally born. He's not somebody that's first generation coming from abroad, but he may have distant beaker ancestry. So I'd like to suggest, and I've been thinking about this quite a lot, a third alternative. Not a murder victim, not a sacrifice, but somebody who has met a violent death but was buried somewhere incredibly special. Is he somebody who stood up perhaps to the changes that were happening at this time? Because this is when the bluestones at Stonehenge were being rearranged. It's a time when that beaker ancestry was taking over everywhere. Had he resisted in some way what was going on? And rather than a murder victim or a sacrifice, should we regard him as the Stonehenge martyr? How do you explain him?
I think, perhaps it's about, the movement of the bluestones, putting one of your own into the ditch kind of makes it your monument. It's that appropriation. I don't know. Or maybe he'd just been really annoying and they shot him. I don't know whether we could tell whether he was a sacrifice or he was. But it's that sort of appropriation of the monument.
Yeah.
It's sort of taking it over.
Yeah.
And I think there are other monuments where you do start to get beaker burials. In the West Kennet Avenue, there are beaker burials at the base of stones.
And the West Kennet Long Barrow.
And the West Kennet Long Barrow.
What's the latest pottery that goes into that early Neolithic long
Beautiful
barrow?
Big beaker pot.
When it's closed up, it's a beaker. Is that another example of these
and
people?
it's them sort of claiming that that monument for their own.
It's fascinating. You know, I would never have thought, I mean, I've been studying prehistory for a very, very long time, but, you know, these advances, they're just extraordinary because they make you think about things in a completely different way.
Just trying to imagine what it would have actually been like for late Neolithic people to see these different sort of style people coming in. So
Would they have really looked
so
very different?
These are some sort of reconstructions of what we think people would have looked like. So some of the snips suggest that the late Neolithic people had a kind of a complexion that would be more kind of Mediterranean, sort of Middle Eastern, sort of slightly more pigmented skin, dark eyes, dark hair. But when beaker using people, you look at their genetics, they've got a much less pigmented skin, blue eyes, blonde hair. So these people coming in would have looked very different from the people that you had kind of grown up with as a late Neolithic person. And then they've got their new technology and their different way of living and their sort of reliance on farming.
Yeah.
And it would have seemed very, very different. And so I think that you've got this kind of apartheid where they didn't kind of understand the newcomers coming in. And the beaker using people were thinking, well, I'm not sure I really get what they're doing. And so they live kind of parallel lives for a bit. But these are sort of reproductively kind of more successful. They have more kids more quickly. And so their population grows.
So you think
they're physically
these two
separated.
populations within that Stonehenge landscape?
Yeah, they're actually contemporary.
Side by side.
Living side by side, but not intermixing.
Yeah. Oh, and at the centre of it, this
And there's Stonehenge at the
monument that
centre.
these people are going, this is ours.
What are they doing?
And and these other people going, oh, hey, you know, we'll take that over eventually.
But the building of Stonehenge, you can see it as being a kind of, you know, the late Neolithic people sort of establishing their identity to these new incoming people and saying, you know, this is us, this is our identity, this is what we're capable of doing. Okay, you've got metal, but look at what we can do.
Look what we can do with stone. Yes, we can do with these. Yeah.
So you've got that sort of sense that you've got these two different communities that are respecting each other. It's just that this community grows a lot faster than that one.
We've looked at when Stonehenge was built and who might have built it. And we're going to explore the landscape. But we've had so many interesting questions that what we've decided to do is to add in an extra film where the Access All Areas team will try and answer some of those questions. So tune in next time to Stonehenge, the unanswered questions, and keep them coming.